Here's the bio for Jeffrey. Jeffrey Grundtner he passionately studied astronomy as a science, earth sciences and the physical sciences. He was and is a lover of earth and sky, spending many days and nights marveling and experiencing both. However, the science of astronomy dismisses the art of astrology outright, and so Jeffrey was skeptical of it. That changed when he read a book about the time in life known as the Saturn return, and so was stunned at the descriptions of dilemmas in his own life that correlated. After that aha experience, he became hooked on astrology, and within a few years was practicing professionally and giving lectures. Jeffrey's background in science gives a unique perspective to his interpretation of astrology. Jeffrey also had a near-death experience at age 11, which made him an empath and a seer, and shaped his entire life. He was taught by a Native American medicine man, studied a very grounded form of psychic development, and has studied with very gifted spiritual healers. His astrology readings are said to be full of compassion, insight, and wisdom, and are often life-changing. So I'd like to welcome Jeffrey, and I'm going to spotlight you, and we will hand off the program to you. Just give me a second. I will put spotlight on. All right, there we go. And now I'm going to hand it out to you and mute myself. So thank you so much for being here. We appreciate this so much.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Hope, for asking me to do this. And I'm very grateful to be here and honored. So we had some discussions about what we might look at in terms of the coming year, and Hope has always appreciated the various perspectives that I've taken. And they're sometimes a little bit more off the beaten path, so to speak. And I think that's kind of what I want to do tonight as well, is to look at a few pieces that are relevant to our broader time here, and as well as to tap into a couple of the things that I think people will appreciate as ways to engage with it themselves. So this is not necessarily going to be a typical, here's everything that's going on with the year, because in many ways, just to give you a quick overview, most of the larger movements of planets which we look at, they're more subtle coming up this year. And in many ways, some of the stuff that has happened in recent years, there's kind of a continuation of that. And I'll get into that in a few minutes. But what I'd like to do is to just go ahead and start with, some of there's been a bit of a revival of sky astrology in recent years. And by that, I mean a direct examination of what goes on in the sky. Astrology, like any other discipline, has gone through various stages and phases. And, there was the sun sign astrology was big starting in the 60s, 70s. But astrology, of course, utilizes all of the planets, and each of those planets represents an archetypal energy. And that archetypal energy lives within humanity and each one of us in its own particular configuration. So when we talk about these elements, it's, sometimes people will refer to it kind of jokingly, what are the planets doing to us now? But in reality, it's more like the, to borrow a couple of phrases from physics, the idea of entanglement and synchronicity. It's more like what's going on in the larger cosmos, we are connected to it. And for us, a planetary energy or movement is synchronistic with different processes that go on within us. You know, for example, the movement of Jupiter it's just Jupiter doing its thing, so to speak, but how we experience it is through the archetypal energies of Jupiter as, you know, for example, a king archetype, but also it relates to legislation, principles, law, and philosophy, just to give you an example. So those things, when we watch Jupiter, and we notice empirically, really kind of going back thousands of years, we can notice things that are going on. And therefore develop what we think about it in terms of the art of astrology, what we notice about it. And it's particularly useful when we look at these bigger cycles and then start to relate them to it. It's all in many ways very complex, but if you understand the planetary movement and energy as being synchronistic to what's going on within the human experience, and that we're relating those cycles to what's happening in our world, that's perhaps an explanation of what astrology attempts to do. And in terms of an individual, an individual's horoscope, it's a marker as, you know, we come into this world as an energy and are born into this form, body, and therefore we carry with us some of the energy of the configuration of the cosmos at that time, i.e. what's going on with archetypal energies at that time. And over time, those things unfold. So with that as a kind of an introduction, I'm also going to let you know that I may have to make some adjustments because I talk with my hands. I hope that's okay. Our PowerPoint is a little bit thin. I didn't have the wherewithal to create a whole bunch of slides. So some of what I'm going to do, I'll be explaining best I can. Okay, so the December full moon was quite a spectacular apparition, and as much as the moon eclipsed Mars that night. Mars was at its opposition, which is its brightest point, and kind of the turning point. See, as the slide says, Mars, the Omega and Alpha cycle. So in terms of one of the ways of looking at this particular cycle, and by the way, this is, I mentioned sky astrology. This is kind of looking directly at what's going on with the sky. I don't know that I completed that thought where we had, at one time, there was sun astrology, then a revival of looking more broadly at astrology. And then there's a lot of people that are really digging into astrology at this point in time in many different ways. And some people are even doing revivals of really ancient stuff. And to some degree, these cycles as seen in the sky, well, I shouldn't even say some degree. I mean, for the most part, some of the mythology that comes down to us through thousands of years are based precisely on those observations. And I'll reference that with the next slide especially. But in this case, what I wanted to talk about here, because even though we look at a calendar year as January 1, 2023, and so we could say, well, that's when society decides the year shifts. But in more natural time, we could see it more as the winter solstice. And so furthermore, we want to look at some of the cycles that are just before this coming year because they really influence it. With Mars, it's a 26-month cycle. And in this case, it has reached its brightest stage for its previous cycle. And in one way of thinking about it and looking at it, it could be considered Mars as going through a process of becoming a new warrior, so to speak, the new projective energy. I think we could come up with different terminology. Then warriors is a personal opinion. Warrior certainly has a lot of noble connotation, but has negative connotation as well. And we consider this planet to be tied more to a masculine principle or a projective principle. And but over the millennia, the warrior and the misuse of warrior energy is very prominent. So we're at a time of changing things, and I think taking a new look at Mars would be a good thing for us to do. It's a little different topic, but nevertheless, if any of you got to see that, it was a truly spectacular event. And this photo was taken kind of well before. It was right after sunset, and it wasn't until closer to midnight here in Central Time that I think somewhere around 10-ish, it was around 9 Central Daylight, and then it emerged right after 10. And the moon became full within minutes of when Mars reappeared, which was a pretty profound experience. And as I was saying, this kind of sort of doubles the notion of there was one cycle ending and another beginning. And so the previous cycle, if we look back over the last 26 months, we might think about, well, how did this type of energy, the projective energy, but also the energy of protection, which is a warrior's job to define boundaries and protect, as well as the idea of venturing out there and using one's energy to establish oneself. Even to some degree, we can see, I'm going to reference Aries later as an energy of finding one's identity and the beginning of establishing sovereignty. So I'm going to mention those few things because in the world going on right now, what we've seen over that period, now I could pick out a whole bunch of different things, but I'm just going to reference the Ukrainian war here because that's so prominent and has so many worldwide repercussions. And in that case, we could see kind of the old sort of degenerate use of warrior energy on the part of Russia to invade a territory, and deny people their sovereignty. And we could see the West, but especially Ukraine, standing up to it. And so Zelensky represents the new and proper use of that Aries warrior. He's out there in front. He's with physical and political courage, and he's doing his best to protect his people. So I wanted to start with that one as a little bit of a backdrop, and it's not a backdrop. It's the idea that we're moving into a new Aries. Mercury's retrograde. So excuse me if I misspeak a few times here. We're moving into a new Mars cycle. And what happens within that cycle, I'm not going to go deeply into that, but within some of these cycles, in this case, this particular one, it goes through various transitions, which are kind of the trials of, we can attach a mythology to it, similar to the hero's journey. But in each case, it's developing a new kind of archetype. So the previous one was an Aries archetype, which I've already referenced as, being establishing one's sovereignty, one's place in the world, and protecting that and finding your identity. And this next one has to do with Gemini. And in this case, we could refer to that archetypally as the development of the masculine archetype of the magician, or also of the trickster. They're kind of one and the same energy, or they're in the same spectrum. And so what will be interesting is that as we go forward, that particular energy over the next 26 months, we can look for ways of using on a personal level, ways we might be using our own personal energy to bring things together to create magic. It's about taking action to create magic. It's the action part of things. It's Mars. On the world stage, we'll probably also see a lot of trickstering going on, and that will make a rather interesting mix. Ultimately, the role of the sacred trickster is to turn things upside down so that we look at them differently and can sometimes create something new. Gemini energy is all about bringing together a lot of different ideas and ways of looking at things. And so it's we can look to the next 26 months as an interesting ebb and flow of active alchemy. Okay, so let's go to the next slide, please. Now, the next apparition that was very close to the beginning of this year, this was a photo I took on December 24th, so Christmas Eve. And as you can see, this is the crescent new moon on the left, and close to the horizon on the right is Venus. Venus is, of course, if you don't know, the brightest planet in the sky when she's visible. And then in the middle and a little above it is Mercury. And Mercury is a somewhat difficult planet to actually see. It took me a long time in my life to get to see it. And in this case, this was a beautiful, kind of perfect conditions, really nice apparition or appearance of the planets together. Mercury was close to greatest elongation and about to go retrograde. So, so there's a lot of interesting things going on with this one, but I'm going to comment primarily on the Venus cycle. And when this is a reference back to some of the ancient mythologies, because the story of Inanna and originated by the Sumerians and then adopted by the Babylonians and Ishtar, survives down to today because it is a beautiful, powerful teaching story, but it describes very precisely what was witnessed in the sky. And so we don't have time to go into a full story of Inanna, but just to give it a abbreviated reference, Inanna descends into the underworld to rescue her sister Ereshkigal. At each gate, there are 7 gates into the underworld. She has to remove some symbol of her power. She was queen of heaven and earth, and She had to remove her crown at the first gate in her descent. She had to lay down her scepter and then her lapis necklace and her breastplate until she arrives in the underworld completely naked. And then she goes through a process that is like a death process and of being cooked. I think the original myth needs to be rewritten so that it has more meaning in the modern time. But, basically, in terms of what's happening with Venus in the sky, is that she's with the sun. She's too close to the sun to be visible. And we consider that the underworld because from a visual perspective, she's not visible. When she's going through a process of transformation. And the story goes on, but when she rises again, each one of these gates, by the way, corresponds to when with a conjunction with the moon. So on the descent, it's Venus is a morning star, and it's the old moon, the old crescent moon. On the ascent, it is said that she is creating a renewed form of the energy she's working on at that time. In this case, the cycle began in Capricorn last year, and she was in the underworld from September until early December. And the first time there was a lunar conjunction was December 24th. So that represents her rising out of the underworld and putting back together that first chakra, that root chakra, in some new way. Now, the particular energy that the Venus cycle is going through at this time is renewing or bringing new wisdom and energy to the Capricorn goddess, or we can think of it as the circle of grandmothers, the wisdom of the grandmothers. And that is the aspect that is being created now and over the next several months until she goes into her next cycle. So Venus cycle is about a 19-month, and then it repeats over 8-year period. Again, I don't want to get too far into some of these technicals because I want you to sort of think about this story, and in this case about 2023. How will Venus, how will the feminine or receptive energy, in this case, retaining the wisdom that maintains the tradition and stability from one generation to the next. If we think of how we think normally of the accumulation of wisdom that a grandmother has, and of being a matriarch of a family, a good grandmother, being a matriarch of a family, and being able to transmit that down to a family, and how we should extend that idea, I believe, to the broader world. Obviously, as a society, we're still working on fully incorporating and transitioning out of the male-dominated paradigm into an equal one, and allowing women and really all people to have full representation in our society. And so we can think about this as, well, where are the cues, where are the key things that feminine wisdom needs to be brought to bear as we go through the broader transitions, which I'll get to in a little bit. But it's a really important aspect I'd like to, I think. And in terms of here in the United States, our form of government was actually based on the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy's form of government, and the clan mothers, the circle of grandmothers had ultimate say-so. The chiefs may have ran the politics, but if the grandmothers, the clan mothers, decided that they weren't appropriately caring for, making decisions that were good for the people, and especially over the next 7 generations, then they would remove that person from chiefdom. And they had a body of wisdom. And the way the United States configured that, well, they unfortunately excluded women, which was a mistake, but they substituted the Supreme Court as the arbiter of whether or not things were being done right. So anyway, obviously here in the West, we've got a long ways to go with incorporating feminine wisdom and obviously full female participation, along with a lot of other people who have been marginalized. But we're certainly a lot farther ahead than, say, those that are backsliding in Afghanistan and Iran. But we're noticing the rebellions there. And so I think that, that just foretells this broader movement. Again, I may come back to reference that. I got a little bit off track of where I was going there, but I think it's good to know that the Circle of Grandmothers was really part of the initial blueprint of the United States that we got from the Iroquois, from the Haudenosaunee. That's their name for their own confederacy. And that's a whole other story. Again, a little too much to go into. But those are some of the backdrops of those inner planets, and they particularly influence us in our male and female bodies and wherever we are on the spectrum of gender, if you will. But more importantly, all of us, regardless of where we are in that spectrum, we have those energies within us. If you're in a female body, you've got both the masculine Mars energy and the Venus energy, and vice versa. So those are some things that we can contemplate in the coming year, kind of more personal level. How can, if you are like myself and you work with ritual and as part of your process of manifesting and navigating in your life, managing your life, it's an important part of what I do, then and I time them to these different astrological movements, because that's when the energy is flowing, that's when it's present. So being in synchrony with it. So anyway, if you do such a thing, you can think about, you're going to have the ability to have more unusual alchemy, to look at different perspectives, try to turn them around and do some magic, and to call on this strengthening and renewed wisdom of the grandmothers, perhaps with a question or of the wise woman. That question of what is the feminine wise perspective that helps to preserve the stability of society and the inclusion of all, I think is an important piece there. So those are two things. I think, Hope, do you have the ability to pause the PowerPoint, so that it's okay, good. Because
Yep.
I don't want to go into
Yep.
the next slide yet. There you
Yep.
did.
Yep.
All right, let me just take a sip.
That I can do easily.
All right. Actually, there was an aspect of that other one that I was going to mention, and I'll just do that without the slide, which is that Mercury position is an important one. That was part of one of the stories of Inanna, where she meets in the Babylonian. It's Nebu, is their word for the god Mercury on her way ascending. And in this particular, this is a pattern that repeats ever so often, and not at every cycle, but this particular pattern repeats, where Mercury is at its greatest elongation, and then it moves very, very quickly. So that was December 24th. And we had, by the end of the year, within, was it a week? Oh, okay. I've created too much data here, and I'm trying to remember exactly. But Mercury went retrograde within a few days. But the amazing thing is that by the first of the year, Mercury was with the sun. So it too is going through a whole new cyclical process. And even though Venus is arising out of the underworld, and I think one of the ways that we would like to modify the notion of underworld, and people may understand it this way, but the underworld is a process of transformation. And in terms of how we discuss it with the planets, we're with the radiance of great mystery. If these inner planets and they're with the sun, it's the radiance of great mystery. So they're being infused with primordial energy, if you will. And going through a transformational process. And so in this case, Venus rising back out to become the new wise woman. And Mercury is just descending. So what was interesting about that last slide, in that the two meeting, it's almost as if Venus is rising out of this transformational underworld process. And it's almost as if a baton is handed. So Mercury, which is representing our conscious mind, but not only, is, if those of you who know some of the mythology, the way Mercury is understood is the messenger that can travel between all of the worlds, the underworld, middle world, and the heavens. And so that has distinct correlates for the different levels of our mind. The conscious mind, and when it's in the underworld, which when Mercury is retrograde, it's a whole different process. And one of the reasons that things get a little glitchy during Mercury retrograde is because the lower elements of our mind, more of our subconscious mind, which has all other kinds of content, emotional content, imaginary content, sometimes the things that we haven't processed yet, that becomes more prominent. It's acting in a different way. So we can deepen our learning because it's bringing more energy into the subconscious realm. And at the same time, as we're trying to process things in this normal realm, things will kind of get out of whack. And there's a deeper explanation of why things like the technology and stuff goes wacko instead of just our minds. But anyway, it's a different modality. And I think what's interesting about that is to entertain the notion that whatever Venus learned in the underworld between September and December, and her process of transformation, and then kind of rising out of that and beginning to put together first that root chakra, survival chakra, we could suggest that information is being brought in at a subconscious level, deeper into our minds, our subconscious minds. And I mean, that would be an intention, at least. There's always a multitude of possibilities when we interpret astrology, but there's at least one can have that intention. And at the same time that Mercury went retrograde at the beginning of the year, we also had Venus was with Pluto again. So she too was sort of revisiting the notion of the underworld and deepening the transformation. In some ways, it's metaphorically a bit like having an early near-death experience in a person's life. Just, beginning to put together the survival energy and then having to transform that again. So there's a whole other deep alchemical process going on with the feminine energy that we all, that inhabits all of us, but in particular expressed by women. So that's referencing the last slide. Now, the next thing that I wanted to discuss was those. Okay, so I did comment on that. I don't know if I wanted to, if I fully completed that. I apologize if I didn't. But the notion of processing that through and how we can engage with that ceremonially or observationally, but at least on a broad perspective, is that the actions that you will be taking, the way that you are exploring a lot of the different ideas, taking action on them, can ultimately create some magic if you find a way to get into your flow. And if you're allowing the wise woman stability within each of us and within the community to help guide our process, it could be a really good alchemical next couple of years, especially on the personal level. It'll happen more broadly too, but I'm sure I could have come up with some references too for what's in the outer world with the Venus cycle. In fact, one that comes to mind was Barbara Walters died almost exactly when, so close to when Venus was with Pluto. And wasn't she a pioneer in, and now, over these last decades, the wise woman elder, but that pioneer in bringing the feminine perspective into broadcasting. So that's a fairly precise manifestation of that particular energy. So now let's see, which way do I want to go next? Yeah. I got to check my time, sorry. Oh, it's already almost 8. Apologize for that, folks, just kind of tending to my... So, one of the things I have already referenced the United States and some of its original, and some of you, as I said, some may know that might be brand new knowledge. In 1987, the Congress, by unanimous consent, passed an acknowledgement that our government was based on the model from the Haudenosaunee. So that was an honoring of their contribution to our way of being, our way of working in the world, our democracy having that form. But something unique has been going on with the United States as well, and this could be seen by most astrologers as well. We've just sort of completed that process. Well, that is the a Pluto, what is known in astrology as a Pluto return. Pluto taking 246 years to go all the way around the sun. So at the time that the United States is said to be born, it takes it that long before it comes to a time when it would need to go through a death and rebirth, a renewal process. And this is a pretty unique thing because of the length of time. Obviously, no humans have lived 246 years that we know of. And nations generally, they go through a lot of transformation. I mean, if we take Britain, for example, it's gone through a lot of things. We can say, well, Britain has been there, but this particular form of government has transformed. And in many ways, it maintained a monarchy even after it became a representative parliamentary form of government. So it's not quite the same. It's pretty hard to look at examples of this. The United States has had as its form of government its constitution and then amendments, and certainly has gone through lots of transformation and wrestled with, some of the original issues. But compared to most other nations, it's kind of the longest lasting of this particular type that we can actually take a look at. So that part's unique. But more importantly, some of the things that I've already said, what I've referenced with Pluto energy is that death and rebirth of going back to the essence of something. And we can think about it as a seed. There's the life of a plant. And in the life of the plant, at its essence, at its core, is the genetics it's received from everything before. And then over that life, it's added all of its own experience to genetic change. And all the energy of that life begins to condense down, distill down, even compost down until there's a new seed. So that metaphorically is a way to look at the Pluto return process. And it's said to be exact for the United States over the last 2 years. And we just had the last exact one at the beginning of this year. Excuse me. However, we need to look more broadly at some of these cycles. Before I do that, however, I want to give a little more description of what takes place, because this distilling down and so on, it also is a period of time with Pluto. When Pluto transits, we call it, when a Pluto activates another archetypal energy, it tends to reveal things that are hidden. And it tends to activate energy that has to do with power, plain and simply, but most importantly, power in terms of societal, because we are talking about the United States, collective power. The ability to bring together a whole lot of stuff, a whole lot of energy in order to affect change on a large scale. And when it activates, we could say, other kinds of archetypes, then we see some incredible things that reveal things about the use of power, etc., or how that needs to change. So I think most of us that are listening in tonight are from the United States. Anybody who's outside that some of what I'm talking about will reference others too, but in terms of the United States, we're going through this process, and what's being revealed is the ways that we maybe haven't used power correctly before, or haven't, the collective empowerment is mismatched. We're dealing with a lot of old underworld issues, and we've certainly seen that. And when I started to say, let's broaden the perspective a little bit, even though that's been going on for a little while, it was particularly heightened in 2020, 2021, 2022. And starting in 2020, there was another cycle. That's why I was going to talk about this in a broader cycle, because it was a particularly powerful, when two planets come together, we call that a conjunction, and that energy brings to an end one cycle and begins another. So that what happened in 2020, and I did a number of presentations on it because I was beginning to look at Saturn and Pluto together in a really long wave perspective. But in the presentations that I gave and the ceremonies that I conducted, I was trying to show people, talked about it, and this was well before the pandemic was underway, that typically at these times, we can see a lot of death happening that affects a change in the structures and society in the world. That's just one piece of it. But it signaled, especially kind of where it happened in the sky, it signaled an intensified process of how authority, Saturn, and power from the people is being used or misused. So we witnessed a whole lot of things between, people trying to consolidate power, both politically and economically. We saw this acceleration of billionaires, for example, on the economic level, and I'm sure politically. But there's also the pushback, the people going, wait a minute, the power you have is from us. So we've witnessed that whole process going down at the same time. So that was kind of like the intensified beginning of the United States going through a Pluto return, which really calls for a deep examination of how power is being used and how authority is being used and how we are going to structure institutions. So it simultaneously began to bring to destroy, there was attempts to destroy and institutions of all kinds. And in other cases, there was transformational things going on. One of the key things too, to remember, and this is where I differ a little bit in some astrologers will talk about, well, that was 2020. But we're still in it because it's going to unfold over the next 44 years. And it actually isn't going to change from this initial chaotic state really for another 4 or 5. And so I wanted to mention that we're still in that process, even though technically the Pluto return happened mostly over 2022, 2021, 2022. And the other piece that occurs to me is that most people are looking at the birth of the nation as July 4, 1776. However, I mentioned the Constitution. Well, we didn't adopt the Constitution until 1788, and the Bill of Rights until 1791. So we've got another, what is that, 15 years or 13 years of deep processing to go through in terms of our form of government, and the institutions that influence it. So that really has contributed to some really large and significant changes. And I'm going to broaden even more for just a moment because I want to bring it out to the larger scale, because I did promise I'd say something about human evolution in here. But in the broader scale, I think it's fairly well known, and we astrologers have ways of measuring that we're in the process of a change of the age. And generally, there's always states of chaos and things of dissolution and reformation, and things that are essential may extend and bring forward into the next stage. But we're definitely in that process of switching into the Aquarian age. And what punctuates that change, which is really probably over more like 150 year, is a reasonable time period, and it could even be more than that in terms of changing from one age to another. But there are also some very sharp punctuation points, and we've had a number of them. So to some extent, we consider that particular Saturn-Pluto conjunction, which is what I just referenced, the breaking down of institutions and the reformation of them, transformation of them, is a deep part of that process, and examining how is power and authority being used. In that larger sense, again, I'm going to go back to the idea that I referenced at the beginning, because I referenced the Ukrainian war, and many people see it as very important for the reasons of democracy versus autocracy, or one could bring it even into more fundamental things about sovereignty. I mean, so much of what, whether it's the women protesting in Iran, and the way they're being repressed in Afghanistan, and from that level to personal sovereignty, people going, I don't know that I necessarily want to be chained to a corporation. I'm going to change how I do my work. We're all really, that's a deep process that's going on overall, and was one of the things that I was working to address shamanically in 2020, and hope to look at more about these different ways and how we can consciously interface with them and do an intentional work to bring about more conscious. I mean, let's just be conscious rather than the process is still going to be a messy one, but we can all contribute in a conscious way to these changes and these processes. So that I'm gonna let me just check on the time. I've got a lot of, I guess we're okay. We're in that process of this Pluto process of things being broken down and rebuilt, institutions going through deep transformation, people trying to grab power, abuse power, people pushing back to reclaim their power. All that is going on in this overall period of time. The good news in terms of 2023 is that some of that is relaxing a bit. We're beginning to get more in understanding of how that might unfold. And every one of these things that I'm talking about interfaces with some of the other cycles that go on as well. Let me just take a brief look at some of the dates I wrote down here. Yeah, so this current new phase of Saturn and Pluto, of having empowered authority within oneself and within society, that shifts and changes in 2024. That's a really significant year. But right now, we're still in that phase and working through that initial process of what does that mean? What's it going to look like? How are we going to work that? And there's an increased tension and a different way of going about it in 2024. There's several things that are converging in 2024. So, this is a year perhaps of preparation for bigger impulses that are coming next year. The other larger context that I want to give this is that we also just completed recently an energy that was the real challenge between the new and innovative and the old and stable. And they were fighting against each other. And since I've been talking about kind of like what's going on in the United States, I think I'm going to continue to use that as examples, and hopefully a person can kind of extend the notion more worldly, or to themselves. I mean, I guess I want to make sure that as individuals we're seeing that as well, that there's been this real push-pull tension between being our own unique selves and living within a society, to give it the personal spin. And in the terms of the United States, that desiring an old way of doing things to continue and trying to innovate can move into a new era. And what was interesting about those particular energies, in this case, the astrologies is Saturn and Uranus, is that the Uranian energy, which is the awakener and rebellion on the broader level, or revolutionary, if you will, it awakens us and it brings about sudden and unexpected change. But it also often does that through technology. And so Uranian energy is tied to those things. These are just a few keywords, not the whole archetypal energy. And is particularly brought about through the youth. They're the ones who are bringing a lot of the new stuff, not exclusively, obviously, but that's one of the ways that it comes through. Saturn is the older and established things. It's the stability of society and institutions, and the old rules, the ways of doing things. And in this case, the Uranian energy, that of taking in new ideas and what is revolutionizing, has to do with our money system and also our relationship to the earth. And so if we look back 84 years, which is the Uranian cycles, the last time it was transiting in that area, we were trying to revitalize the earth from we were in the Great Depression, so obviously we were trying to work to create the belief was that we were creating a more equal, as well as stable, but more equal money system. But we're also changing our practices, bringing new technology, as well as going back to really kind of the old and ancient way. We had really abused the earth. And the droughts of the 30s require dramatic change. So that's one thing to understand, is that the Uranus in that area, aspecting that area of the sky, has a lot to do with our care of the earth, and it has a lot to do with bringing value in a more equal way to individuals. And I'm going to carry that notion, or that archetype, even a little further. And the words that came to me the other day were embodied value, because this energy, Iranian energy, is in Taurus, which is really all about being in the earth. And it's about embodiment. So on a personal level, we could be thinking about how are we bringing more of our own unique self into embodiment, or bringing our energy into embodiment. That's on the personal level. Can we broaden that? Can we see how people might be trying to do that all across the world and society? And that contributes to these bigger changes. And at the same time, we're trying to create new rules. Saturn was in Aquarius, and Aquarius is about trying to create new and innovative things. Saturn is about creating a set of rules. So there was a battle, 2021, 2022, between creating new rules, looking towards the future, or holding on to the past and trying to work with what it will be the mix that will prevail. Typically in those kinds of energies, it's not one winning out over the other. That usually doesn't work. You do have to find the balance between those, or you start to create chaos. And that was during that time period. And I think, in terms of the United States, legislation that was passed, climate change legislation, et cetera, would be in that innovative, creating new rules, looking towards the future. But we're also trying to hold on to things from the past, et cetera. And we're still working all of that stuff out. And that's a perspective that's important to see, that we have to give, when in astrologies, it's these energies, these archetypes are squared each other. And when you have a square between those, you've got to find a way to give each its due. And when they work, I don't know that you can see my hands, but then it becomes like the pistons of an engine, and it creates a form of power. It's not different ways that planets work together or against each other. This is one of the ways that they can work together. So, we can always hope and intend that interplay between those energies will create some kind of continuity, but give it a power base of moving into the future. And that too is something that is going to continue to unfold here through this year. But that tension is let up. So the battles between those is not quite as strong, even though here in the United States, we've got divided government, and we don't know what that's going to look like yet. It might mean nothing much gets done, or it might mean that they actually do more debate and work out things where we get some good results that help move us forward. Mars in Gemini, by the way, is also about debating ideas. And at its highest level, it can be about debate. At its base level, it can be fighting words, let's just say, and we don't get anywhere. So this is, I'm expressing some of these ideas, and a lot of these things are possibilities of manifestations, but they're also inviting us to have intent, to work with the energies in positive ways within ourselves, within our group of people, and by extension, sending out ripples of influence to others, so that through our understanding that we need to entertain different ideas and discuss them and debate them, and realize we have to move into the future, but we need continuity with our past and the stability with what we have now. If that's the overarching principles, and knowing that we've got to have some processes of deep institutional change, and the way that authority is exercised and power is exercised, it's going to be a much longer process. But if we can start with these pieces, we can have good outcomes. And if we can incorporate that into our personal life, if your focus is, well, what can I do with this coming year? I won't attempt to repeat them anymore. If you need to, you go back to that as a recording, but do some magic, incorporate some grandmother wisdom, debate different ideas, even within yourself, about how you want to move forward, and find a way to establish new rules that gives you a more embodied value. Okay, I guess I did encapsulate that.
So I'm going to jump in because
Okay.
we have a question in chat, and I want you to answer that briefly, and then we want to go to break because it's 8:17. But the question is, and if you can't answer it briefly, maybe we need to go to break. But the question is, we will be having a Sun-Pluto conjunction on January 18th. I am wondering what might be revealed. Will the USA be able to do some deep shadow work because of this?
Well, we need to be aware that there's every year there is a Sun-Pluto conjunction transiting in the sky, and it'll shift gradually through time as to the date that it happens. Mm-hmm. So that by itself, I think that's a good thing for someone to do personally, or even to intend for the United States. But in terms of the United States, we would need to, and I haven't prepared all that, but we would need to look at things that are specific to the United States chart. So what it references is that there's an energy that is available to us to bring more light into our personal underworld, and we might see some things on the world stage that happens that week, because it won't be just that day. You can go a week either side of that, and there will be energy shining in that area, and shadow work can be done at that time. But for the United States, we need to look more at their specific chart. And as I referenced earlier, I think we ought to be looking at not only our Declaration of Independence, but also the Constitution and other things. And as I so often do, I prepared way more than we're probably going to get to. And so
that's okay. That's okay.
Yeah, so
if we can take a 5-minute break, and then that doesn't mean you have to stop talking. It just means we're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we can come back and you can continue.
My intention was to give all of this the broader context, and what I wanted to lead up to here eventually is what's really going to be happening in 2024, and how this year is somewhat in preparation for that. But since we are looking at this year, I'll continue to mention and try to do it in a little more abbreviated way, some of the other shifts and things that are happening in terms of the beginning of this year. Another energy shift was in the astrological language, Jupiter entered Aries. And that's a pretty significant energy shift out of kind of a more dreamy state into taking action. And again, I'm just going to be referencing the idea of having more optimism to strike out for one's own sovereignty and identity, and more determination, and that that's more or less on a personal level. But it's also, I mean, kind of, I've been circulating around the whole notion of the United States and so on, but the idea of a new legislation or adventures in law, so to speak, that too is kind of going on. But in terms of what Theosophists might be interested in is generating or even acting on some ideas about philosophy or teaching. So basically, we have the this energy of growth and expansion and optimism is in general, for people in general, of wanting to move ahead with their ideas and their adventures. I mean, it kind of naturally fits our beginning of the year, but it's amplified because of this particular position of Jupiter. And like I said, there's going to be a desire within areas of the law. But on the flip side, it can also be kind of aggressive use of the law. So we may, in fact, see more lawsuits or legal matters that come to the fore. That doesn't last for very long, however, because Jupiter moves into Taurus fairly quickly, and then stays mostly in Taurus, which does. I'm not an expert in economic astrology. That's not an area that I've studied extensively. I look at more of the broader cycles, so I don't want to make big predictions, but that does suggest more of a stable growth for the latter part of the year economically. But in terms of the philosophical things that I have been discussing more primarily here, it's also a period of time where that idea of embodiment is heightened. About once we understand what our philosophies are, or it's also about making things more real. If, for example, somebody's about to take off on an adventure, they're a new venture or something like that, that period of time when it's in Taurus, it's an examination of, well, is this a secure thing to do, and do I have the resources to do it? So I'll just kind of leave that there as just some suggestions, and allow people to sort of fit it in their own personal life or in the life of the United States. It does suggest a more positive time, however. I'd have to look more closely to see if there's any kind of counterindicative things, because I know we're in this time of inflation. And I think one of the things I want to mention, however, because a lot of the stuff I've been talking about, these breakdowns of institutions and things, there are things that have like that idea of inflation and the way that the Fed is going about doing it. Like, what they're concerned about is that they'd actually like to have more unemployment, because that way the wages aren't rising. And that's kind of an old model. It's like, pardon me, but the rich get richer and everybody else has to stay the same and make sure that happens. I mean, it's not, I don't have an answer to it. I just recognize that it's not, it's a model that requires workers to provide their service at just enough, so to speak, and that the corporations and wealthier entities are favored in our current system. So maybe over time we find a better ways that we can still have innovation of capitalism, etc., but that there's more equity. I think it's been pretty elusive, but at any rate, just thought I'd throw in that side comment that the economy as it is going through some deep transformational things, and it's going to do so in a rather glitchy way. That in and of itself could be a series of seminars and discussions. But anyway, so back to what else is going to be unfolding through the year in terms of transitions of modalities are the planet Saturn, which I've referenced many times, is an energy of making things real, and then extending it to the mundane realm. It's about institutions and stability. But in ourselves, personally, it's about owning our own authority. In other words, being able to write the story of our own life from a position of strength. And that moves out of the energy of the Aquarian energy of, of wanting to write new rules and looking towards the future into the energy of what we're envisioning, what we're idealizing and dreaming of. And so the consequence here, what I could suggest from that is that people being able to go into the realm of what is their dream and how could they make it real. And again, I'll leave that there. In the broader world, it could mean more to do, if we intentionalize it, more to do with the dissolution of the way institutions are going on. So this would be a pattern over the next couple of years. Dissolving current structures and idealizing them, or at least bringing seed points to bring more of an idealized version of those things. So that's an intention to work with from the broader level. And then by the end of the year, Pluto moves out of Capricorn, where it's been for the last 14, 15 years, since about 2007. And really a lot of this breakdown of institutions, governments, et cetera, has kind of been going on since then. At least that corresponds with it. And it moves into the area of Aquarius. And this is kind of a wild card thing. We have to go back, once again, we have to go back 246 years and see what was going on in society the last time Pluto was in that sign. It ventures in there briefly, it moves back briefly into Capricorn, and then finally into Aquarius in 2024. So in terms of this coming year, as I said, it looks more in terms of what the planets are suggesting to us of kind of working through some of the same stuff. Not a lot of significant changes, but some subtle but profound changes and differences in modalities. Way of working things. And it leads up to 2024, because several of the cycles that I've mentioned go through a phase shift, a tension time in 2024. And in addition to that taking place,
we have, oh, you know what, Hope? Put up, um, in a minute, I'll have you put up the next slide. I feel like we can kind of run a little bit short of time to go in depth in that. But I think we're getting a complete picture with what I'm offering. I hope, anyway. Several of the cycles that I've already mentioned are going to converge, shifting what we call the phase into a different phase where there's a little bit more struggle with what was initiated, but also a settling out where things get sorted out better. And that's coming down in 2024. And one of the things that I want to mention about that, before we go to that slide, is we have a second Great American Eclipse. If people will recall, we had a Great American Eclipse where the path entered on the West Coast and crossed the totality path crossed the United States through Missouri and southern Illinois and exited out near Sumter, South Carolina. And that we could have some discussion about that, but it was interesting. That was in 2017. And it was sort of the presaging the whole eruption of things that went on later, because in 2017 we had just a lot of things starting to come to the fore, and somewhat specifically around those areas of the country. Excuse me, did I say 2024? I meant 2017. But in 2024, I said come to the fore. 2024, the second Great American Eclipse. I think the previous one kind of initiated this whole business about othering and bringing up some of the stuff about the United States' original sin around slavery, but also an extension of the way Native peoples were treated and many other groups. But those are the ones that were really prominent. Clearly what went down in 2020, that eruption of, this control of a particular group and how it was not working so well. In 2024, that particular eclipse is going to cross from Mexico, starting off the coast of Mexico, and go up through Texas and Arkansas, southern Illinois, across the Great Lakes states, and up through New England, and then exiting out through Canada. And even though I made just a quick and abbreviated reference to what was going down 2017 and subsequently in connection to those areas where the eclipse passed and the issues, that's interesting. Well, with all the different things that are converging in 2024, including this eclipse, one of the things that may be really prominent is, really fully all the way across the North American continent. But, and I don't necessarily want to be nailed down this as a prediction. It's just a notion that in my mind at this time, because I intend to do ceremony with that one. I did it with the 2017 eclipse. I'm going to do something special with the 2024 eclipse, and hopefully there'll be a gathering of people so we can set intentions with it. But at any rate, if you think about the direction of that one going from south to north, and the idea of all the immigration and how are we really dealing with immigration, and how are we dealing with our neighbors in the North American continent, Um, One of the things is where those two eclipse paths cross is southern Illinois. And when I went down there this past fall to look for a location to have my ceremony, I discovered some very interesting things. It doesn't seem, like just southern Illinois, but where the Ohio comes in and just north of that. Well, it turned out, unbeknownst to me, but a very significant passage of the Trail of Tears was through that area. And there's historical markers for that. There are things about the land there. There's Carbondale. There was a coal was being mined, and that was a significant early thing in terms of use of fossil fuels and driving the Industrial Revolution. There was one of Lincoln's speeches that initiated his time, where the issue of out of which the Civil War erupted and of slavery were laid down. And ironically, there's a place where there was a reverse underground railroad, where there was some dastardly human who was tricking runaway slaves to come to his version of a plantation, and then he would imprison them and send them back. There's a hell of a lot of history in terms of the shadow of the United States that has been imprinted in that area. So I'm still exploring about that, but I just feel like, I don't know what will come of this eclipse. The area of the study of astrology in terms of eclipses is a little bit much more art and a little bit nebulous than some of these other things, which we have more empirical evidence for, in my view. And but I think it's going to be a pretty cool thing, in my view, anyway. We'll have fun with it, no matter what, witnessing that total eclipse and hopefully doing some powerful work with the energy of the earth and aligned intentions. I would need to get down into more specifics about what's happening in 2024. It's really potent year. But the piece that I was just going to share with people is that I mentioned the idea that the United States is going through a Pluto return really over the next couple of decades. And that's about a death and rebirth process of being renewed. It's also in starting next year. It's getting very close this year, so we're always sort of feeling it. Is the energy of Chiron? Chiron was the centaur king, born of a god and an aspect of the earth. They say a sea nymph, but we should read that as an aspect of the earth. And he was born when he was born, he was so different that his mother didn't know what to do with him. And so she had turned herself into the linden tree and abandoned him. And the Kronos, the sky god, it's not his realm, and he had left, so his father had abandoned him. But he had the heritage of both being an immortal god and a being of the earthly form. And he was born half human, half horse. And Apollo and Artemis adopted him and taught him all of these incredible skills. And eventually, there it is, the wounded healer centaur. He ended up getting wounded in the animal part of himself with one of his own poison arrows. And that he couldn't die because he was immortal, and he couldn't heal his wound despite all of his skills. So he traveled the world learning more about healing techniques and teaching others and healing others. And as long as he was doing that, he could never heal the wound himself. It was only through an act of compassion and taking Prometheus's place, where he knew the result of that would be that he would die. I'm giving you a very truncated version of this. I did a longer version on a event I did 2 nights ago, because it's a very, very rich mythology and is so critical and important to who we are in this transitional stage, because it really suggests us being able to move into higher levels of consciousness through the process of developing our own specialized knowledge out of that sacred wound and offering it to others. And by acting out of compassion and teaching from whatever it is that each one of us as individuals may have within us from our experience, we can then collectively elevate all of humanity. And I mentioned this because the United States, once again, the United States is going through a Chiron return in 2024. And we are approaching that. So we can look at this when I take a person's individual chart and I kind of examine what might be that wounding. What is that? What is that wounding that one has that compels you to keep working to heal it? And are there ways to activate it to help others? Because ultimately we become healed as individuals when we stop identifying with the wound, when we stop making our identity the wound we have, and we simply offer the medicine that it has given us. That's when Chiron was elevated to godhood. Zeus took compassion upon him when they saw his selfless act to take Prometheus' place, and instead of him dying, he was elevated to godhood. So there's something really profound in that whole mythical story. And in terms of the United States, one of the things that is also interesting in the broader cycles is we can go back 51 years to the last time Chiron was in the position it was when the United States was born. And what is interesting, just think back of everything that was being initiated in 1973, and that had to do with the use of, or the establishment of sovereignty, the establishment of territory, and of individual action. I think I could go more deeply into that, but I think I'd better leave it a little more abbreviated. Maybe that could be an interesting discussion, but just to plant some seeds with all of you, just to think about, I've mentioned the women's movement can often here, and we think about that in the West and in the United States, the women's movement, the environmental movement. But we also had Richard Nixon trying to, abuse his constitutional position to hold power. And so we're going to be in a repeat of a number of those things, and how we resolve it collectively is important. So I think I will, just leave it at that. As I said, I sometimes prepare more than than we can possibly cover. And I know this was a lot of information, but I hope it gives you some food for thought, and to let it percolate. And let's, if anybody has any questions, we can take a few minutes to do that.
Our first question is, do you have any books to explore mythology of planets?
Ariel Gutman did a great job of doing that. It's called Mythic Astrology. I'm looking at my bookshelf back here. It's probably back there. Ariel Gutman and Mythic Astrology. She did a pretty comprehensive examination of that. There are many other sources, but that would be one book that comes to mind immediately as a good reference point.
Thank you.
Anything else?
And if you just unmute yourself, you can just speak up, or you can put a chat in and we will read your chat out loud.
Oh, just a quick question about Pluto going into Aquarius.
Yes.
I can't remember when it goes to 0 degrees relatively soon and then back to Capricorn.
Right.
So do you have a comment about it seems like sometimes when a planet first moves into another sign, we see get a taste of some of the things that
Right.
are stimulating. I'm curious about your comment before.
Well, so Pluto actually, there's I didn't say this before, but there's a lot of shifting of energies in March. And one of those is Pluto briefly goes to 0 Aquarius, March 23rd. So it happens right around the equinox. So that's going to be a rather potent equinox. But I think, then let's see the rest of that description. As you said, it goes in briefly and then it moves back. It doesn't finally move in until January 20th, 2024, that it moves into Aquarius. But that is, I think that what we're going to see is a deeper transformation of the idea of democracy and equality, as well as some revealing about not only that, but I guess the other thing is really about technology. I mean, I think many of us are aware of the ways that technology has gone awry. I mean, I'd like to do something on how, and never mind that, but how there's ways that technology has contributed to the breakdown of not only institutions, but belief. I mean, I had some more things here about how our connection to truth and what that really means has broken down. There is some planetary correspondences to that and potential for ways out. But I think we'll see that some of that is brought to the fore more, and there will be changes in that realm. But also a kind of depth of acceleration and examination may be triggered as that Pluto transits Aquarius. A lot of discoveries in research over the next 15 to 20 years, and innovation in the social realm about how money and power and governments are working, but also deeply with technology. I think one of personal opinion, but one of the things that is really, really critical is that with all that accelerated change from all of these things that are happening, being able to keep rooted and stay on the ground and connected. I mean, the heart connections are the most vital to our community and to people around us. But also just referencing back to the notion I was saying before, the elder wisdom, yes, it needs to transform and be brought into the new reality, but we need to be able to have continuity from our past and into the future. We start to lose our roots, I think. We need to do those things wisely. Now, a lot of that was more my opinion than the astrology, but I think what we can expect in that first venture in, let's see, it goes back into Capricorn in early June. So it's only there for 2-3 months. So I would look for things about kind of new announcements in terms of technological innovation and I don't know. I'd almost like to think about that one for a while. Sorry, I hope I didn't dodge your question.
No,
I'm just giving you vague
no,
ideas.
that was fine. It was great.
Okay, good. Was there another one that can be?
Yeah, I want to read. Do you have any, Victoria Martin says, do you have any thoughts regarding the Jupiter, oh, I can't talk, Jupiter Uranus conjunction in 2024?
Oh, yes.
Another half
More
hour.
excitement,
Yeah.
more excitement, more possibilities. Yes, those are, that's why I said I took enough time to express this background. I didn't know for sure about the depth of understanding of our audience. So I thought giving it that background was important, but certainly that particular expansion of technological and innovation, and as well in the social realm, there's going to be a strong expression for democratic representation. It's going to be one hell of an election year in these United States, and hopefully we remain united. But that's a particular transit that does happen more frequently. Roughly every 15 years or so. So it's not. Let me see if I ran that transit. Well, I didn't for that tonight to tell you when the last one was and the next one, etc. But yes, it's going to. I guess, and this might show a little bit of my bias, but I think it's going to also bring about a more urgent growth in the area of taking care of the earth. This is because of where it's happening, in that, in Taurus, and the idea of value that could also represent some significant changes in the seeds of significant changes in our money system. So certainly you're going to have a lot. Sometimes with Jupiter, there's an overexpansion. It's about broadening opportunities. And so there may be a lot of opportunities in the areas I just mentioned, different technological changes, the areas of democracy, and the ideas of equality, and in terms of the things about caring for our earth and how can we innovate in those areas. So it can be an overexpansion, but it can also be a really positive. Out of that settles out the areas of growth, and what is needed by us as individuals is finding alignment with our own philosophical underpinnings. What guides us, what is our road, and then allowing the innovations that are going to come in. Again, if we intentionalize it, the energy of Uranus can be a very positive thing. It helps us get over blocks. It can break up old things that need to be broken up. If we don't pay attention to them, Uranian energies can be very disruptive and cause sudden and unexpected changes. So all of those are somewhat of the possibilities, but having an optimistic perspective, I'm looking for more democratic process and more advancement in the way that we care for the earth and via technology. I mean, maybe they'll start pushing for the electric car coming. I don't know. I haven't, that one I'd want to meditate on as well. Like, what will that mean? But that gives you some broad ideas that it's a potent time, and I hope for helping to restore our relationship to the earth,
Erica says, you made a wonderful statement about Chiron, and I couldn't write it down fast enough. And we will have it on the recording, but it referred to we can't heal until something about Chiron. Can you say that again? It
Well,
was. I agree.
okay. I'll try to pick up on is the idea that we, as long as we keep pursuing the wound, and it's part of our identity. We're not going to be able to heal it. The focus needs to be on the notion of what is the medicine I've gained from that. And so from a personal level, we look at the sign and placement of our Chiron and how it's relating to other of the archetypal energies, other planetary energies within our own chart. If we're talking about an individual. And then what I typically do as a counseling astrologer is I'll look at those energies and discuss it, and it'll come out how the particular soul, the person in front of me is, how they've been living that, what the wound is, if they feel vulnerable enough at that point to talk about it with me, which I hope and usually they do. And then the notion is, well, what medicine have you gained from that? And this, to give you a little, a specific example, my Chiron is in the 8th house, conjunct Mercury and Sun. I had a near-death experience when I was 11. It meant that I've lived with type 1 diabetes, and I've had lots of other issues. Well, but what was the gift that it gave me? That is that type of a near-death experience, a conscious out-of-body, massive soul retrieval thing that I was helped to understand what it was about so that I can bring more of my own soul light, my own soul information into presence, and what would I do with it. So the gift of it, the medicine of it, is that I'm a shaman, and I have an ability to work across that with the other side, so to speak, and to understand some of these things more deeply. So it also has given me a gift of really deep compassion, the ability to have insight, to put myself in the place of another. I don't know. I don't want to talk a whole lot about myself, but the gift of it was the fact that I have this very expanded perspective and the ability to communicate some of these principles. That would be one consequence of my particular wound. I have to continue to live with diabetes until that's cured. But in terms of the curing or the transcending from the soul perspective, is being able to live with, stop identifying with the wound that I have and identify with the medicine that I have to offer to others. And a key piece is that when we all do that, when we all recognize what gift of medicine, what beauty of our comes out of our wounding, and when we can offer it to others, there may be just one or two others that, or a bunch of people, it doesn't matter, but when we offer it to others and it makes a difference to them, we start to elevate our consciousness. We start to elevate that vibration and experience of, the Buddhic compassion and the Christ love, if you will, if we want to use those, but just being more fully human. I don't know. I hope that answers the question. And if I said it differently the first time, which I often do, then go back to the recording if that really, tweaked it. But we have to stop identifying with the wound.
Yes.
And
yes.
Be the medicine.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. I often tell clients, it sounds similar to when they say, "Hi, this is Erica, by the way."
Hi.
They will say, "I have this. I have."
Right.
I have a pain in the neck. I have this. It's like they state it as if that's who they are,
Right.
It's like, no, separate yourself from it. Rephrase how you say it. Start simple. Just rephrase how you say it, but that kind of thing. But yes, you did say this beautiful, succinct little sentence, and it's in the recording, and I will find it.
Okay, great.
So thank you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And there's another question, which I was also thinking interesting, in a different way. I had a different phrasing of it, but MJ Cayley says, any interest in royalty, for instance, Harry and William split, or I would say also the shifting of the royalty of that big transition of the queen mother to, or the queen to the
Precisely.
queen.
Yeah, and the old and the new. And I was thinking that too about Harry. And okay.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you're kind of speaking to it. I don't know what precisely to add, but for sure that with the death of the queen, this longest reigning queen, signaled a really strong transition that ties in with the whole idea of the death and rebirth of institutions. I mean, the British monarchy has been an institution forever. Fortunately, it has already gone through some transformations, but I would rate this one as a pretty significant one. And the fact that, Harry and Meghan are not just, I mean, obviously there was an abdication of the throne in the early part of the 20th century, which was quote unquote scandalous and whatnot, but somebody choosing to, Edward choosing to have his own life rather than take on the responsibility and be limited by it. And that's sort of what they are doing, but they're taking it to a whole other level, in as much as it's going to, I think, require the monarchy, such as it is, to go through even more deep examining and transformation. It would be an interesting thing to discuss. I don't have a ton of information about the royalty, but I do see that as certainly fitting the process. And on the other hand, you see William is his whole project of the Earth shot. That's a whole significant another use of that energy, and King Charles right along with it. King Charles has always been very progressive in terms of we need to be taking care of our Earth and shifting things. Now, how much consequence will they have? To me, I look at it, the archetype of the king and the royal family. Well, that archetype and princesses and all of the rest of it, king, queen, princesses and princes, etc., that all still lives very strongly within us. From the Jungian perspective, we're supposed to be inhabiting our own, sense of kingship or queenship in the world. And that's part of that aspect of depth psychological transformation. But they still exist out there in the world, and they're still relevant. People are still really interested in what's happening with that. That's a root that goes way, way back. I have a whole, it makes me think about the broader work that I did with the whole Saturn Pluto thing, and some of the our need to look at the dominator archetype and how that got initiated, going all the way back to Atlantean times, when we got off track with the king and queen back in the Leonian age, as a way to look at it, and somewhat metaphorically, but the idea that it was the Leonian age 13,000 years ago when the sense of sovereignty got hijacked. And now we're here entering the Aquarian age, and we're trying to correct that long time distorted karma, where for periods of time, all sovereignty was given to one individual or one family. Whereas the realization of our full humanity is for us all to be able to live out of that sovereignty but also have a kind of organization, a kind of Saturnine institutional organization where our unique expression and sovereignty is both honored and kept from impinging upon those rights of others. That's the area where we've made some progress as human beings. The United States has made some progress. Other democracies have. But man, we got a long ways to go in our psyche and everywhere else. And I think that's some of what we're witnessing. There's people who are looking back towards dictatorships and autocracies because they want to abdicate their responsibility to somebody else, their responsibility for their life and for others, and put it on one individual. That's old paradigm. And we need to drain the energy from that old paradigm so that we can inhabit it in a new way and bring it into the next stage. I got a little off track there, but anyway.
No, that's totally relevant because you and I, Jeffrey and I had that conversation last week. Also, the life and death. I mean, it's really like kings and queens decided life and death, and
right.
Autocracies and also tyrannies and dictators just across all the whole population of whoever they're over. Right. Have that power of life and death. And I suppose to some extent, even in democracy, when you send people out to war, you have that power as the commander-in-chief or whoever the general is. But it's nuanced, and in a dictatorship, it isn't. Or in back in the day, the king, off with their heads, wow.
And pardon me for interrupting, but the resurgence of these autocracies at this time, I mean, some of us are going to go, what? What's that all about? Well, I see it as the death throes of that particular paradigm. If we look at it that way, that this is this transitional stage, this shadow phase in the depth transformation, well, there's all this churning that's going on at these deep levels of the collective human psyche. And as we're going through all of these transitions, I mean, I like to encourage people to go, we're not going to go back to whatever you thought normal was. And I suspect that the people who are on this call probably see it that way too. Whatever we thought normal was is not going to come back. We're creating a new normal. And that means that we're going to be having to become more comfortable with the discomfort of chaos. But through that process, the things that are being stirred up, like, oh man, the old way, we're latching on to this old way. There was stability when we had a good king or a good queen. There was stability and everything worked and we all just went about our business. Well, that is no longer. But because that's still there deep in the psyche, we're bringing that back up, and people are turning to that. As some way to try to, create a normal again. But, it's that process that we're in. And so it doesn't surprise me one bit that it's coming up. But being vigilant in the process of bringing us forward into the new paradigm is really important. And the more of those energies get drained and redirected, and that's something that has to be done from an individual level, primarily about honoring sovereignty. That might sound a little bit non sequitur, but I would have to I'd have to go into more depth about my thinking on that in that area.
It's self-sovereignty, honoring our own self-sovereignty versus handing it off to anyone else. Ever.
Exactly. Yeah. And that sounds great, but it's a process. And I guess I will mention some of the work I did around that in 2020 was about reclaiming our energy from all of the ways we participated over lifetimes even, because we can participate unconsciously in a dominator construct. And that essentially is that. If we relinquish authority to someone else, there's a whole other set of parameters that I described in that. But certainly when you're doing that, and not, there's this whole other subtle thing that goes on, and it's not the direction of the human evolution, but we start by reclaiming our energy and living within our sovereignty and recognizing when we're participating by either being dominated or dominating others. And there's a subtle difference in between that, between good administering and managing and domination. Maybe not so subtle, but it's an important thing to reclaim our energy from the old paradigm so that it's available to create the new.
Mm-hmm. Something else occurs to me. I've been observing the revealing things that have happened over the last, the setup I heard from 2007 that all the secrets are going to come out, and
Yep.
all the secrets. So even okay, the buttoned up, quiet. Don't ever reveal anything of the royalty. All that is just like blah. The book that just came out. Harry's right. Harry and Meghan. Yeah, I have to remember their name, but he's like, blah. He just he gave all this out, and the rest of them are like, oh no. And maybe it's a good thing that his grandmother died before that happened. She's like, I don't want to be here to see that. She could not handle that kind of a reveal. So, but it's like had to happen. It's like, here, rip off the covers and look under that, and all kinds of things, but especially that old way.
Yep. Well,
all right. Thank you all.
Yeah, this was good, and I appreciate the questions, and I hope y'all appreciated my ramblings and that it made sense to you.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much, Jeffrey. It was very good and interesting.
Thank you.